Hello one and all to the video. Today we are going to be talking about psychology approaches. Now there's quite a lot of ground to cover in this particular topic, so I might go through it quite quickly. Hopefully I'm going to try and slow down maybe a little bit just so it's a bit easier to understand. Might make the video a little bit longer than it would be, but that's alright. I hopefully should get through quite a lot of content, but as always, check the comments to see if my teacher has posted anything, pointed out anything that I got wrong, added any extra information that you might want to use, and yeah, enjoy the video. So, starting off, psychology was first invented by a guy named René Descartes in about the 1600s, who basically said that human behavior could be studied and analysed. However, it properly became a science much later, when a guy named Wilhelm Wundt wrote The Principles of Physiological Psychology and made the first psychology lab in Germany. Here they broke down experiences into their most basic elements. This was called introspection. It recorded basic sensations through thoughts and feelings in responses to basic stimuli. So this is sort of where the science originated, and from there it sort of moved on with different approaches being made and such and such. Moving on to the approaches themselves, there are around 6 to talk about, and then depending on how long the video is at that point, I may do some comparison between them. So, first up is the behaviorist approach. This approach assumes that we are all born as a blank slate, or tabula rasa if you want to sound smart. And that means that all behavior is learned through experience. This is called conditioning. Because of this, only directly observable behaviors can be studied. The first big thing to know in this is classical conditioning, which is learning through association. This is when an unconditioned response to an unconditioned stimulus is paired with a neutral stimulus. So the neutral stimulus produces the unconditioned stimulus, which is now referred to as the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response respectively. Yeah, this is easier to understand in an example. The research you need to know here is Pavlov's dogs. When the dogs saw food, they salivated. So every time the dogs ate, Pavlov rang a bell. After a while, whenever Pavlov rang a bell, they would salivate, with or without food, because they've made the association between the bell and food. Understand? Yeah. The second big thing in this approach is operant conditioning. This is where behavior has consequences, so the frequency of a behavior is affected by whether these are good or bad consequences. The research to keep in mind here is Skinner's research with some rats. Skinner had 3 kinds of boxes. In the first box, if the rat pulled a lever, a pellet of food would drop. This resulted in the rats pulling the lever more often. This is called positive reinforcement. Action causes good thing, action done more often. The second box had an electrified floor, which hurt the rats. If the rat pulled a lever, the electricity would stop for a bit. So, the rats pulled the lever more often to prevent the bad thing. This is called negative reinforcement. Action stops bad thing, action done more often. Finally, he had a box where if a lever was pressed, it would start the electricity. So, the rats pressed the lever less to avoid the shock. This is called punishment. Action causes bad thing, action done less. These two things make up the majority of the behaviorist approach. The next approach is called social learning theory. This is similar to the behaviorist approach as it also says that behavior is learned. However, SLT also claims that we can learn behavior from observing others, and also that cognition plays an important role in learning. This approach was suggested by a guy named Bandura, who said that Skinner's ideas were wrong. Bandura said that people view very specific role models and learn what behavior is punished and reinforced through them. The observer is also very likely to imitate their role model. This imitation is heavily dependent on identification with the role model, so them being perceived as similar. Also, the observed status of the role model, so they are more experienced, or a celebrity of sorts. This is backed by the Bobo doll study, where kids were shown a model beating up a doll. Some models were men, some were women, and it was found that kids were more likely to reproduce the behavior if the model was the same gender as them. This study and all its variations comes up a lot in psychology, so it's a good one to know inside and out. Next up, we have the cognitive approach. This approach assumes that internal mental processes can and should be studied scientifically, and that internal mental processes are private and should only be studied if inferences can be made. This approach says that all behavior is caused by internal mental processes. One thing this approach uses are schemas. These are packets of knowledge, beliefs, and expectations built through interactions with our environment. They're unique to each individual and help organize the world around us and direct our behavior. I like to think of them as different folders in a cabinet. Each folder is on a different topic. This cabinet allows us to quickly access any necessary information for whatever situation we are in, kind of like a mental shortcut. However, these can sometimes lead to faulty conclusions as they can overlook some information. Theoretical models are a way of identifying the likely stages of informational processing. These are often laid out in computer models, which suggest that the mind processes info similarly to how a computer would. To finish this approach off, cognitive neuroscience is a study of how underlying biological processes influence our thought patterns. So this basically boils down to scanning the brain and seeing what lights up when you think about a certain thing. Moving swiftly onwards, we have the biological approach. This approach assumes that there is a direct link between brain activity and cognition, and that biochemical imbalances in the brain affect behavior, and that behavior is inherited and determined by genetic stuff. And by genetic stuff, I mean genes. These are the weird spirally things that we get from our parents that determine everything about us. Eye color, height, personality, you name it. This means that oftentimes kids take after their parents in many ways. This is often studied through twin studies, where concordance rates, so the rate at how similar the two are to each other, are looked at when the twins are raised apart. So the more similar they are, even though they're raised apart, means the more influence that biology has on them. Whereas if they were very different, it means that environment has a larger effect. Another part of the biological approach is that our behavior is a result of evolution and natural selection. So similar to how we physically evolved to adapt to our environment, our behavior evolved in the same way. Finally, we have the influence of what I'm calling brain junk on behavior. Part of this looks at how different parts of our nervous system, brain included, are responsible for different behaviors. For example, the limbic system in our brain is responsible for emotional behavior. The other part of this looks at the different hormones and neurotransmitters that carry messages around the body, and how an imbalance in these can cause effects in behavior. Next up, we have the psychodynamic approach. This approach assumes that our behavior is affected by unconscious motives, so all our behavior is determined, and that our behaviors and feelings as adults are rooted in our childhood experiences. This approach is really old and was done by a guy named Freud. The first thing to note here is the role of the unconscious. This can be explained with the iceberg model, which is probably on screen now, with the mind being split into the conscious, so what we are aware of, the pre-conscious, things that bubble just on the surface and often come out in dreams, and the unconscious, things that we are unaware of that influence all of our behavior and personality. This can also include repressed memories. Additionally, this approach says that our personalities are formed by three parts: the id, which is our pleasure principle, the superego, which is our morality principle, and the ego, which is the thing that balances the two others. The ego makes sure the other two stay in check to avoid either one becoming dominant and negatively affecting the individual. Moving on, we have various defense mechanisms that are subconsciously used to reduce anxiety. First, we have repression, which is where the mind pushes the unpleasant memory into the subconscious. Secondly, we have denial, where the mind refuses to accept a negative situation. And finally, displacement, where the strong emotion is expressed onto a substitute. The reducing anxiety here comes from being able to express that emotion. Finally, for the psychodynamic approach, we have the psychosexual stages of development, which everyone goes through as they go through childhood. Children cannot move on to the next stage until they have passed through the one they are currently on. Being stuck on a stage has an adverse effect on adult behavior, depending on what stage they're stuck at. And Freud said that a child is not fully considered an adult till they complete all of the stages. First, we have the oral stage, which takes place from around birth to 2 years old. Here, pleasure is gained from doing stuff with your mouth, like chewing or sucking. Next up is the anal stage, which occurs from around 2 to 3 years old. Here, the focus of pleasure moves to, you guessed it, the anus. If a child gets stuck here, they run the risk of becoming anally retentive, meaning that they will be over-organized, neat, and reluctant to spend money. Next is the phallic stage, which occurs from around 3 to 6 years old. Here, the area of pleasure moves to the genitals, and it's where boys experience the Oedipus complex. Long story short, this is where boys want to have sex with their mothers, and the father is seen as a rival. So to fix this anxiety, the boy becomes friends with the father and behaves how he does to see him as an ally instead. This is known as identification. Girls experience a similar thing called the Electra complex, where the rival is the mother and the desired person is the father. Next is the latent stage, which occurs from 6 to 12 years old. In this, everything that happened before is repressed, and the child is able to focus on being a kid. Finally, the genital stage, which is from 12 years and onwards. This puts pleasure back in the genital region just in time for puberty, and all sexual desires become conscious. However, fixation on this stage can lead to difficulty forming heterosexual relationships. Finally, we come to the humanistic approach. This approach assumes that each individual is unique and that we are all different and should be treated that way. It states that behavior is under our conscious control and that we all have free will. The first thing to know here is self-actualization. This is the belief that everyone has an innate tendency to reach their full potential and achieve self-actualization. This is different for everyone, but reaching it is said to be the ultimate feeling of well-being and satisfaction, and is the top level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a set of needs to reach self-actualization. One cannot achieve the needs in one level until they have achieved the needs from the level below. This is a bit easier to understand using the picture on screen now. The ones at the bottom are the most important to be fulfilled, starting with physiological needs like food, to safety needs like having enough money to live, to love/belonging needs like having a positive relationship with friends and family, to esteem needs like being confident in yourself and respecting others, to finally reaching self-actualization. Finally, we have the focus on the self and congruence. This says that there are three versions of the self. The self-concept, what you feel you are, the ideal self, what you want to be, and the real self, so what you actually are. It is argued that you cannot achieve self-actualization until your ideal self and the self-concept are similar or congruent. However, this is very difficult to achieve. To finish off, thank you very much for watching, everyone. Sorry if I went through it a little bit fast, but I will be getting my teacher to watch this, and hopefully they will leave some helpful advice in the comments of anything that I missed or things that you could add. Um, Also, leave some criticism if you want in the comments. I do want to get better at making these, so it does help, but do try to be constructive. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone. I hope you enjoyed, and see you in the next one.